Hey everybody, Jon Stewart here. I am here to tell you about my new podcast, The Weekly Show, coming out every Thursday. We're going to be talking about the election, earnings calls. What are they talking about on these earnings calls? We're going to be talking about ingredient to bread ratio on sandwiches. I know you have a lot of options as far as podcasts go, but how many of them come out on Thursday? Listen to The Weekly Show with Jon Stewart wherever you get your podcasts.
President Biden will step aside as the presumptive Democratic nominee. He will suspend his bid for a second term, and instead he will pave the way for a different Democratic candidate to face former President Trump this November.
This is a remarkable development, and it comes after a morning in which we heard more calls for the president to step down from members of his party, including, for example, Senator Joe Manchin.
On Sunday, July 21st, President Biden officially dropped out of the 2024 presidential race, stepping aside and endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris for the Democratic nomination. Biden's decision came in response to mounting concerns regarding his mental and physical fitness. The ultimate question asked by many, was Biden a viable candidate? Many feared that he was not.
It's no longer the conversation, I guess, for like lesser of two evils for me. It's more of like both of these candidates don't feel like viable options.
But what exactly does it mean to be a viable candidate? And do our current 2024 candidates meet this criteria? Let's find out.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Nationally in this limited election series podcast produced by Immigrantly Media. We discuss issues that matter to some of the most overlooked immigrant and minority communities in the U.S. As the election season continues, we'll examine key moments that offer insight into what to expect in November. In today's episode, we'll be taking a deep dive into the notion of viability. What does it mean for a candidate to be viable? And do the 2024 presidential candidates meet this criteria? We are your host, Juan Diego Ramirez, independent journalist.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani, a political science professor. And this is Nationally. So, JD, how do we define viability in the context of this presidential race or elections? In the weeks following President Biden's unimpressive presidential debate performance, this term was thrown around a whole lot. And many questioned Biden's viability. Others wondered if Trump himself was viable, given that he's a convicted felon. And yet, what do we truly mean by this term? We'll begin today's episode by breaking down this idea, establishing a specific set of possible criteria for candidate viability.
In recent discussions, there are in fact several ways in which we may define presidential viability. First and foremost, one of the most basic fundamental levels there is the mental and physical fitness. And this is precisely what Biden was frequently criticized as lacking.
And next, there is constitutional viability, right? Referring to the qualifications one must meet in order to be eligible to even run for president. According to Article 2 of the Constitution, a presidential candidate must be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, and a resident of the United States for at least 14 years.
And then finally, we have what I like to call the democratic eligibility. In other words, has a candidate gone through the necessary democratic process in order to be properly selected? And this entails winning both a primary election and being officially nominated by delegates at the party's national convention. I think this begs the question again of who is defining viability. And I think we have to break down the difference between the press, like journalists, marketers, the people that pay to push a message, and pundits, the people that give us their opinion and takes on everything political, right? And I say this because I want to really emphasize that there's a lot of blame on media and specifically journalists when it comes to opinion giving, when a lot of them are not journalists themselves, they're pundits. And I just want to make sure that we know the difference between them two and who really makes these terms popular, like viability.
Well, and I think I would just add to that, JD, right? Like, you're a journalist. There's a really big distinction, to me, at least, between a journalist and the media, because especially written word journalists, I mean, yeah, that should be about reporting, and maybe they're reporting on who's saying someone is viable. But a proper journalist should not necessarily be adding their own opinion. The problem is, right, you turn on CNN, you turn on MSNBC, you turn on Fox News, and it's all pundits, right? Like, there's not a whole lot of journalism happening there. In fact, we barely get news from around the world. Most of what they have is talking heads. And so that's, I think, where the slippery slope is, that, ultimately the media, in more of this infotainment sort of world where they're just trying to get clicks and get viewership, isn't actually performing journalism that is meant to be a watchdog of democracy, but instead trying to entertain people. They have a whole lot of punditry. And that's where we have these like pushed narratives around viability of any candidate.
Right. I mean, and let's get back to this word viability, right? That's in there. I mean, let's talk about Biden, right? Like, the conversation regarding Biden's viability first began to shift on June 27 during the first presidential debate. Obviously, that was horrible on his end. And what some had been quietly wondering for months suddenly entered the national conversation, right? We were talking about, like, when is he going to drop out? Is he going to drop out? Please drop out. So, yes, that happened. The debate left many feeling uncertain, obviously. Then the president spoke in a weak, quiet voice, stumbling many of his words.
And I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
He appeared lost or confused, losing his train of thought, and occasionally staring blankly into the distance.
Making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Questions of viability only grew after Biden made a series of verbal slip-ups at his press conference at the NATO summit. I don't know if you remember this, but on July 11th, that did not help his case. The president not only appeared to mix up two competing world leaders, mistakenly introducing Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky as President Putin, but also later referred to his own Vice President Kamala Harris as Vice President Trump.
And now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be Vice President, but I think she was not qualified to be President.
Many began to express clear concerns regarding Biden's mental fitness. In a post-debate landscape poll conducted by a group associated with Biden's Future Forward super PAC, 69% of respondents expressed that they were very or somewhat concerned about the impact of Biden's age on his ability to effectively serve as president. Similarly, in an ABC News poll released at the beginning of July, 85% of respondents claimed that Biden was too old for a second term. 67% of respondents further claimed that Biden should withdraw from the race. Biden also received immense pressure from fellow Democrats. Several dozen Democratic representatives and 3 Democratic senators publicly called for Biden to step aside. And I actually really think that Adam Schiff, who came out calling for Biden to step down, was a real game changer, I think, in this whole conversation. Even Nancy Pelosi put quiet pressure on Biden to step down. The bottom line, many across the nation did not see Biden as a viable candidate any longer after that debate. In this instance, viability appears to refer to the fundamental notion of mental and physical fitness itself. After all, if one cannot properly or coherently even address a group, how can they hold presidential office? And so, I think it begs a bunch of questions, right? Like, was the microscope that was put on Biden warranted, or are people reading too much into these few mistakes that he had? Because remember, not that long ago when he had given the State of the Union address, he came out all fiery, and I was like, wow, someone gave him some vitamins today. And he was a different Biden just a couple months ago. Maybe he was just having a bad day or something. I don't know. Or is this really what needed to happen, right? Because there are real questions about his viability. I don't know, JD, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think definitely age had a lot to do with it. He showed signs of aging. If you are an adult with aging parents, you see this. It's just true. This is something that connects with people with aging parents.
This older generation of Democrats, maybe Biden finally learning the lesson. Ruth Bader Ginsburg stayed on the Supreme Court and wouldn't let Obama replace her when he was president because she believed in her soul that Hillary Clinton was going to be president and she wanted Hillary Clinton to replace her. Look, she did all sorts of good things on the Supreme Court, but at the end of the day, that selfishness ultimately led to this incredibly conservative court that we now have that, is pretty out of touch with the majority of Americans on a whole host of public policy issues. In California, Dianne Feinstein. I mean, people hadn't even seen her in months. And she insisted on coming back to the Senate after having a bad bout of shingles. Her memory was clearly not there. And my goodness, if you said anything about Senator Feinstein, then you were blasted on social media for being some sort of bad person. But the reality is she was not mentally fit to do her job. Some would say on the right, Mitch McConnell has showed signs of that as well. He had that press conference where he just kind of froze and stopped talking and no one knew if he was going to be okay. There's this generation of older politicians who are latching onto power and will not relinquish it, do not want to pass on the baton. So I think, there are real questions about viability in terms of age and physical fitness. And in many ways, I'm glad that Biden has taken this step because we've seen this happen, unfortunately now, time and time again. And I think it's good to see this baby boom generation perhaps beginning to accept that it's time to pass the torch.
It's time to pass the torch. And, now Biden will no longer be the oldest presidential candidate.
That is so
now
true.
It's on the other side.
That's right. Now viability in terms of age and physical fitness becomes into question for the one and only Donald Trump. And this notion of viability even takes on different meanings when discussing Donald Trump. In response to questions regarding Biden's viability, many also stop to ask whether Trump himself is a viable candidate. And it's worth mentioning that Trump has made his fair share of frequent verbal gaffes. As many of us already know, he gets things wrong all the time. For example, the former president has confused Biden with Obama. He's mistaken a poll for a legislative bill. He's mixed up Democratic former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi with former Republican South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, and many more. And such mistakes may perhaps be interpreted as an indication of faulty mental faculties, especially for these gentlemen of a certain age. However, it's often challenging to determine whether Trump has made a true unintentional verbal gaffe or even a very intentional lie. After all, he's really known for lying about a whole lot of different things.
That's simply not true. There's no data to support what he said. Once again, he's exaggerating. He's lying.
In all other ways, Trump appears to meet the mental and physical requirements of viability. Discussions of Trump's viability have less to do with his mental and physical faculties and more to do with various other flaws that people have pointed out, right? Like more relevant to Trump's cases, perhaps, is question of constitutional viability. Many have asked whether we can truly consider a 34-count felon and perpetual liar to be a viable presidential candidate. And yet, the presidential qualifications clause in the Constitution mentions nothing regarding one's history of felony convictions, nor does it mention a requirement to tell the truth. As crazy as it may seem, Trump is still viable to run for president as a convicted felon. But what about Democratic viability? The fact remains that Donald Trump won the Republican primary election by a landslide, right? He was officially chosen as the nominee during the Republican convention in mid-July. So, is Trump truly a viable candidate?
When we come back, we'll continue discussing what it means for candidates to be viable.
So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
We're back. Before the break, we talked about the different types of viability and why Biden's campaign was no longer considered viable.
Now, let's continue that conversation into talking about Trump and Harris's campaign.
You asked this question, JD, and you said, oh, what about Democratic viability? And I really loved that question. And the way I think about that is, at the end of the day, the voters decide. And yes, Republican primary voters have selected Donald Trump. But at the same time, there were large numbers of even those who participated in the Republican primary who had said no to Donald Trump, who continued to vote for Nikki Haley even after she had announced she was no longer in the race. And I really wonder where those folks go in November. I think that is a question for them, right? Do they believe that Donald Trump is viable to be president of the United States? Not just to run, but to be president. I don't know if they're going to vote at all. To me, them casting that ballot for Nikki Haley, even after she dropped out of the race, could be interpreted as a sign that they are saying, I might be a Republican, but I'm never voting for Donald Trump again. And I think that's the ultimate Democratic viability standard, right? Is whether or not a voter's going to vote for you. And a choice that voters have is to just stay home, to stay on the sofa, to, tune it out and listen to Charlie SEX.
Yeah. I mean, right. Speaking of brat, let's talk about Kamala Harris' viability, right? With Biden's endorsement and the immediate support of various prominent Democratic officials, party leaders, and political organizations, Vice President Kamala Harris is poised to become the Democratic Party's 2024 nominee. So how about viability when it comes to Harris? Well, seemingly mentally, physically, and constitutionally viable, it's worth asking, does Kamala Harris meet the criteria for the Democratic viability? Of the possible Democratic candidates that have been discussed earlier in this episode and considered, Harris has been vetted more than most. She was, after all, elected by the nation in 2020 and selected once more to serve as the vice presidential nominee in the Democratic primary this year. However, there are a couple of points worth mentioning here.
First of all, citizens weren't given any real choice in the Democratic primary. The primary was more ceremonial than anything else, as Biden was simply presumed to be running again. So people didn't have a chance to see who the range of candidates even would be. Second of all, there is a notable difference between Harris being selected as a vice presidential candidate via the Biden ticket than her being selected as a presidential candidate herself. In an ideal world, within the Democratic Party, right, through the primary process, people should have had a choice to choose their presidential candidate. And we didn't get that chance. That, to me, doesn't necessarily make Kamala Harris not viable, though. These are extraordinary circumstances. I mean, we are living in this historic moment where we can't go back in time. We can't go have a redo. And it would have been great if we could, or if, Joe Biden from the get-go had just decided that he wasn't going to run. But as we've seen, and as we've talked about, we've seen his decline just in a matter of a couple months from the State of the Union to this first debate. And so given all of those circumstances, I think it makes sense for Kamala Harris to be that nominee. I think that she is totally viable in that regard. And I think while these are comments that are being made and people do feel that way, given the circumstances, I I think she's absolutely the most viable for the Democratic Party.
So perhaps then Harris does not quite meet the Democratic viability criteria in the way we might hope. But it's worth mentioning, however, that we are in unprecedented times, as you mentioned, and desperate times call for desperate measures. At this rate, a primary simply isn't possible, right? And Harris has been democratically selected to a greater degree than most. She may also be considered more democratically viable once she has been officially selected by the delegates at the Democratic National Convention in August. So, do moments such as these suggest that there are perhaps flaws within our democratic system, Sara?
Well, I don't know. I've never seen a moment like this before. I want to just keep stressing, right? Like, this is historic. It's unprecedented. We've never been here before. I mean, even if we go back to 1968, when LBJ says that he's not going to run, it was earlier than this. And there was a primary, and there was a war that was raging. RFK was the presumed nominee for the Democratic Party and was shot and killed, right? Like, so that was unprecedented in its time. I think this is unprecedented in our time in totally different ways. And no doubt both campaigns are going to continue to sling questions of viability at one another. But we as the American public, as the voting public, we sometimes need to be able to see through some of that punditry and some of the hype.
Right. I got to ask this question because I think it's important. Is it legitimate for a candidate who has not been officially selected in a primary to run for president?
It goes against the norm of our times, for sure. But prior to the 1960s, it was quite common, in fact, that so-called party bosses or the party leadership would select the presidential nominee for a party. I mean, what are delegates and superdelegates anyway, right? The norm has been that they choose who is selected through the primary process, but the whole process exists so that there is a way in which those delegates could potentially choose someone else. And that's true on both sides of the aisle. So while this question of viability maybe goes against the norm that we're all accustomed to in this generation, we have seen this practice in the past. And considering everything we've talked about, I think it comes back to what I mentioned before. At the end of the day, what decides democratic viability is what the voters decide. And at the heart of the idea of America is the idea of one person, one vote. Come November, the most viable candidate for the President of the United States will be selected by the American people. And I look forward to that process and continuing to break it down.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Nationally Podcast, brought to you by Immigrantly Media.
We hope you liked this episode. Nationally releases weekly on Thursdays on all streaming platforms.
If you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, please email them to info@immigrantlypod.com or reach out to our socials at Immigrantly Media on Instagram and Immigrantly_pod on X.
You can find me on all of the socials at Sara Sadhwani.
And you can find me on all the socials at JUANDR47.
Nationally is produced by Sadia Khan and Sophia Sanchez. This episode is written by Emmanuel Monahan.
Our sound designer and editor is Juan Velez. The Nationally theme music is by Simon Hutchinson. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound.
Thanks so much for listening and have a great week.